Hello and welcome to Business Insider with Mario Toneguzzi on YYC Business, brought to you today by Megapix Media. Joining me is Colin Craig, who is president of secondstreet.org. Thanks, Colin, for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me, Mario.
Well, you have a new report out today looking at governments and spending and employee pay cuts. So tell me just a little bit about what your key finding is from that report.
Yeah, so we looked into this issue because when the pandemic arose, we saw lots of news stories about businesses struggling. And in many cases, they had to tighten their belts, and that meant pay cuts for employees. And so we thought, you know what? We never see any stories about the government doing the same thing. So let's ask governments right across the country a simple question. When was the last time that you had to cut employee pay? And so we filed these requests with the federal government, all 10 provinces, 13 major cities. And what we found at the federal level was that they told us that they had no records of ever cutting employee pay. And so I was actually pretty surprised by that. I know back in the 90s under Prime Minister Chrétien, they had to really tighten their belts as a government to get the deficit under control. I thought there may have been something there, but no, Ottawa said they don't have any records of ever cutting employee pay. And at the provincial level here in Alberta, as best we can tell, the last time there was a major pay cut or widespread pay cut, I should say, across the government was in the 1990s under former Premier Ralph Klein. I believe it was 1994. It's a 5% pay reduction. And so that was the provincial level. And then here in Calgary, the city, you might expect that there would be some kind of pay reduction, just given that the city has really struggled for about 5 or 6 years now. And no, City Hall showed us a whole bunch of data and going back to the 1970s, and there have been no pay cuts over that period. So really what we see in this country are two worlds when it comes to working. If you work outside of government, there's a good chance that you may have had to, deal with a pay cut, pay freeze, some kind of a reduction in benefits, whatever. And then on the government side, it's been largely business as usual.
So why do you think, for the most part, in general sense, governments don't pursue pay cuts for people that they employ in times that are challenging?
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of different reasons, and they all kind of contribute to this sort of secondary work world where there's no real challenges. People don't face challenges the same way that they do outside of government. One of which is that in government, you have politicians making decisions about salaries and benefits ultimately. And it's up to them to make that call to say, hey, wait a minute, we're going to have to reduce pay, cut back on pensions, whatever it is. And politicians don't want to do that because the people that they're making those cuts on, they vote. And so they could cost them votes at the ballot box. Or the other thing that we often see is that unions, they take some of the millions of dollars that they get in union dues each year, and they use those to advertise against any politician that dares to suggest that they take a pay cut. So it could be challenging for politicians to do this. Another big reason is that politicians are spending other people's money. Whereas in the private sector, you have businesses and business owners that, they care more about those dollars, I would argue, than what you see in government, because it's their own money. It's shareholders' money. It's a small business owner's money, whatever the case is. And the other big difference in the business side of things is that they have to compete. So you have those competitive forces to keep wages and benefits in line. And those businesses are subject to fluctuations in the market. If the market struggles and that business struggles as a result, well, then guess what? They have to make those decisions that are not always fun, but it helps keep businesses stay afloat eventually over time.
So tell me why this is important, to know the fact that governments aren't going in this direction, especially in these times. Why is it important for people out there to know this? And I don't know, frankly, what can people do about it?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things to consider. One is fairness. Governments are funded by private industry, and those who work in private industry, they pay taxes. Those dollars, some of those dollars go to government, and then they hire people, they pay for services and so forth. So when you have the people that fund government struggling, and yet the people in government aren't struggling, you're really creating an unlevel playing field there. So that's one, is that there's an issue of fairness. I think the other thing too is we have to remember that across the country right now, governments are spending a lot more than they're taking in revenues.
Yeah.
And that's not sustainable. I mean, obviously, there have been challenges presented by the pandemic, but governments are going to have to get their expenditures under control because it's not sustainable. And so often in government, what we hear is that, for example, the city of Calgary always presents this binary choice. They say, look, you either face tax increases or service cuts. This is the choice that they always present to the public. So tax increases right now would be it'd be a very bad decision because so many businesses and homeowners and families are struggling. And then on the other side of the equation, service cuts. Well, I mean, people want to make sure that if they need to call 911 for a police emergency, that the police are there, or that bridges are going to continue to be repaired and potholes and whatever. So the governments present this binary choice. There's a third option. So instead of laying off workers or cutting back on services, what the government could do is just reduce pay a little bit, maybe 5%, 10%, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And then that way the services continue that the public cares about, but it just costs government a little bit less, and they can use those savings to help bring their expenditures and revenues back into balance.
Okay, super. Colin, before I let you go, I'm just curious if you could describe for me what secondstreet.org is and what you guys do.
Yeah, so we're a public policy think tank. We look into all kinds of different government policies, from compensation for employees to natural resource development, healthcare policy, all kinds of different government policies. We really try and focus in on stories as well. What are the stories behind the numbers? How are people affected by these different government decisions? And so people can go to our website, which of course is secondstreet.org, and they can learn all about us. They can sign up for our email updates, follow us on social media. And if people really like the work that we do, they can make a donation.
All right, super. Thanks for joining us today, Colin.
Thanks a lot, Mario.
All right, that was Colin Craig, president of secondstreet.org. This has been Business Insider with Mario Toneguzzi on YYC Business, brought to you by Megapix Media. Thanks for joining us.